On a silent night, in the dimness of the living room, he hears something that should never have been heard. Her phone, resting on the table, vibrates. The words spread through the room, cold and unmistakable, "Come tonight." He stands motionless, the blood freezing in his veins as the truth unfolds in front of him in a whisper. She knows he'll be away at an important meeting, far from home. She had already prepared everything, timed the perfect moment for her lover to come, for the stranger to invade their home. But that night, he decided to pretend he had gone out, determined to find out, to test how far the lies could go. The clock on the wall makes every second seem eternal. Outside, he hides, waiting. His heart, once full of love, now beats at a frantic pace, mixing despair, anger and the urgency to see how far she could go. He looks out of the window, illuminated only by the dim light of the street. The car stops in front of the house and, when his lover finally gets in, he takes a deep breath and walks back inside. The decision had already been made. The door closes behind him with a loud bang, and he announces his presence. Surprise shows on her face, deep shock on her lover's. The silence that follows is suffocating, but he doesn't hesitate. With a firm, impassive voice, almost without emotion, he says, "I want a divorce." It's not a scene of pleading, discussion or regret on her part, it's the end. The lover, stunned, tries to leave, but the tension in the air is palpable, like a thread that no one dares to cut. The time that passes between them from that moment on is made up of glances that try to hide the unmentionable, unspoken words that corrode the air between them, and a growing pain that he carries alone. When she tries to approach him, seeking an apology, he just stares at her with the cold gaze of someone who, once and for all, has lost any illusion. Unbeknownst to her, he is already determined to fight for custody of his children. He remembers every moment, the little signs that now make sense, the late-night messages, the hidden smiles, the different perfumes she wore that day. Everything is clear now, like a jigsaw puzzle that he has finally put together, and nothing will stop him. She tries to mumble some explanation, but he cuts her off, the words sharp as a blade. "You don't need to say anything. I've seen everything I need to." She looks at him pleadingly, but he remains motionless, distant, as if she were a complete stranger. The figure of her lover, once a safe presence for her, now disappears, fleeing through the door like a thief in the night. And when silence finally takes over the house, he realizes that this will be the last memory he will keep of her, her figure standing there, in shock, with the weight of all the lies between them. But there's something else she doesn't know. One last act, one last decision. He intends to snatch from her not only the title of wife, but the right to be a mother. He knows that, with everything he has seen and the evidence he will collect, he has the chance to take custody of the children, to keep them away from falsehood and to preserve the home of a love built only by him. She will never see this turn of events coming, she will never imagine that he, the man who has always trusted her, is willing to throw back every pain and every lie. He is determined to expose everything, to show the world who she really is, to make her mask fall in front of everyone. Every step he takes towards the exit door is a promise. A promise that she will pay the price for every whisper exchanged, every time she deceived him, every night he slept next to a lie. He doesn't need to say anything more, the silence between them says it all. And as the night progresses, he disappears from the house, leaving her alone, with guilt weighing her down like a chain, and the certainty that, this time, he won't come back. The plan is in motion, and nothing can stop it. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any form of betrayal. All the stories you will hear are fictitious and carry a clear message: betrayal destroys lives, families, and the trust that people build up over the years. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense story, full of twists and turns and deep emotions. Good story, and remember, the consequences of betrayal always take their toll. In a charming suburban house, with large windows and a well-kept garden, lived Thomas and Claire, a couple who, at first glance, seemed to share a serene and prosperous life. Thomas was the kind of man who easily stood out for his calm and determined attitude. He had built his career in a financial consultancy firm, and the respect he inspired among his colleagues was the result of years of hard work and integrity. Claire, a vibrant and charismatic woman, was an art teacher at a nearby school. Her passion for what she did was infectious, the students adored her, and her smile lit up any room, bringing a feeling of warmth and welcome. The couple had 2 young children, Liam and Sophie, aged 5 and 8. For both of them, family life revolved around these 2 little worlds that demanded attention, care and unconditional love. Thomas and Claire used to reserve weekends for family activities, such as picnics in the park or visits to museums, where they encouraged the children to explore the world with curiosity and imagination. When they were together, the connection seemed genuine, as if every moment, no matter how simple, had a special and profound meaning. Thomas admired Claire not only for her love for her children, but also for her spontaneity and the lightness with which she faced life's challenges. She was the woman who brought color and life to the environment, with her colorful paintings, infectious laughter and her enthusiasm for telling stories about everyday life at school. Thomas observed every detail and found her unique, a partner with whom he had chosen to share his life, his plans and his future. In the rare moments when they allowed themselves time alone, away from the responsibilities and demands of the family routine, they still shared long conversations about their dreams, as if they were young again, dreaming of what was yet to come. But over the years, their marriage began to be shaped by the demands of their professional lives and the pressures of everyday life. Thomas, always dedicated to work, began to spend long hours in the office, dealing with the increasing demands of his career and the pressure for results. Although he tried to maintain a work-life balance, tiredness and worries often accompanied him home, weighing on him like an invisible shadow. Many evenings he found himself sitting at the kitchen table, revising reports while Claire put the children to bed. Claire, on the other hand, felt the distance growing between them. The routine of being a mother and a professional demanded a lot of her, and the small joys they had once shared seemed to be slipping away, like memories that became harder and harder to reach. Sometimes she found herself recalling the moments when Thomas looked at her with intensity, as if she were the only person in the world. She missed the way he held her hand and the smiles exchanged in silence, which didn't need words to be understood. Now, these gestures seemed to be lost somewhere between the demands of their lives and the exhaustion that consumed them. Despite everything, Claire still had a deep respect and admiration for Thomas. He was a man of integrity, caring, someone she knew she could always count on. Although she knew that time and circumstances had driven them apart in many ways, there was still love, and Claire held out hope that, with some effort, they could rediscover the connection that had once bound them so tightly. From time to time, she planned little surprises, such as dinners for 2 or quick getaways to the countryside, in the hope of reliving the moments that had made them fall in love in the beginning. Thomas, for his part, noticed Claire's gestures but, immersed in his own worries, found it difficult to fully reciprocate. The pressure to provide for his family, to ensure a stable future for his children, kept him trapped in a constant sense of obligation and duty. He wondered if one day it would be possible to relieve this burden and live more lightly again, to allow himself to feel love more freely and carefree. The small gaps that had formed in the relationship over time were almost imperceptible, but they were there, turning what had once been easy into something that now required effort. It wasn't a question of a lack of love or commitment, but rather the inevitable consequence of 2 people trying to reconcile marriage, family, and individual ambitions. In the midst of all this, Thomas and Claire kept up appearances, not only to others, but often also to themselves, as if avoiding confronting reality could somehow keep them safe. One day, in an after-dinner conversation, Thomas talked about the possibility of a promotion he was about to receive. He seemed anxious, torn between pride at the opportunity and fear that it would mean even more hours at work and, consequently, more time away from his family. Claire listened carefully, trying to offer support, but feeling a pang of sadness as she realized that, in the midst of all this, their time together would become even more scarce. "I know how much this means to you, but will we be able to find time for each other?" she asked, her voice laden with a slight melancholy. Thomas, not sure how to answer, just gave her an encouraging smile, trying to ease the tension. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's promotion came through, bringing, as he had feared, new responsibilities and more pressure. The office now felt almost like a second home, and he found himself increasingly absorbed by reports, endless meetings, and negotiations that seemed to have no end. Claire continued to support him, but silently felt that her husband was drifting further and further away, as if he were being pulled into a universe she couldn't reach. On one particularly difficult evening, Claire was sitting in the living room, her eyes fixed on the family photos arranged on the shelves. The image of her and Thomas on their wedding day, radiant and full of hope, seemed to belong to a distant world, almost like a dream. She sighed, feeling a weight she couldn't explain. That intense love, which had once been the basis of everything they were, now seemed diluted by the passage of time and the routine that surrounded them. Thomas arrived late that night, exhausted and distracted, and barely noticed Claire's distant expression. He went straight to the shower and, as the water ran, she wondered if they would ever be what they were again. Liam and Sophie slept peacefully, oblivious to what was going on in their parents' minds, and Claire wondered about the responsibility of keeping the family together. Perhaps it was her task, after all, to bring Thomas back, to find a way to break the cycle and restore the love that bound them. That night, alone in bed, Claire found it hard to sleep. Her mind wandered between memories and thoughts of the future, trying to imagine what life would be like from then on. If she was responsible for keeping the family together, then what else could she do? What sacrifices remained? At some point, as the silence of dawn enveloped the house, Claire fell asleep, but the restlessness remained in her chest, like a persistent reminder that something needed to change, that perhaps they needed to confront the truths they were avoiding. The feeling of emptiness and disconnection that enveloped the couple was like a constant whisper, something they both realized but weren't yet ready to face. They each harbored their own anxieties, uncertainties and frustrated dreams, and every day the space between them seemed to widen, like an invisible line separating them. However, beneath all the doubts and fears, there was still a spark, a hope that somehow everything could be different, that they could find a way to save what they had. And so, in the midst of this tense calm, Thomas and Claire continued to live, trying, each in their own way, to deal with the challenges of their lives. They both believed that the love that had once united them could be enough to overcome any obstacle, but fate, as always, had other plans and, unbeknownst to them, they were about to face the greatest trial of their lives. That evening, Thomas arrived home late after another long day at work. The lights in the living room were off, and the house seemed shrouded in a dense, almost oppressive silence. He entered the bedroom and saw Claire asleep, wrapped in her blankets. Watching her, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and nostalgia. He remembered the days when just her presence seemed enough to dispel any tension. Now, however, even with her so close, there seemed to be a distance he couldn't cross. Next to her, Thomas lay down, feeling the softness of the sheets and the light scent of her perfume that still hung in the air. He closed his eyes and, for a moment, allowed himself to believe that this distance was just a phase, something that would pass with time. However, a nagging restlessness wouldn't allow him to forget the little signs, the subtle whispers that something in his world had changed without him realizing it. Over the next few days, these signs began to appear more insistently. That morning, for example, Claire was more animated than usual, she seemed charged with a new energy. She hurried off to work, flashing a quick smile at Thomas, but he noticed that there was something different in her eyes, a peculiar sparkle that he hadn't seen for a while. Over breakfast, as he thought about the day's tasks, this change kept nagging at him. Thomas's mind was haunted by questions he didn't dare ask. He wanted to believe that her liveliness was the result of some new project at school, or perhaps a chance reunion with an old friend. But the days went by, and each unusual detail seemed to add to the growing weight on his chest. One night, while he was putting the children to bed, he heard Claire's cell phone vibrate in the next room. She was in the kitchen tidying up, so he picked it up and looked at the screen. It was a short message, from a number he didn't know, so, tomorrow at 7. He felt his heart squeeze, but immediately suppressed any suspicion. He didn't want to believe that it meant something else. He put his cell phone back and took a deep breath, hoping he was just exaggerating. The weeks dragged by with a silent tension. Claire continued to go out frequently, always with a different excuse, and Thomas, although he tried to ignore it, felt increasingly isolated. The lightness that had once united them seemed to have disappeared completely, replaced by an abyss of doubts and forebodings that he tried to deny. One afternoon, while in a meeting at work, something inside him broke. He felt he had to face what was bothering him, find out what was behind Claire's changes. He decided that night he wouldn't go straight home, instead, he would lurk around, watching from afar. Perhaps it was an extreme course of action, but the feeling that something was missing made this decision inevitable. With his mind flooded with a mixture of fear and determination, Thomas prepared himself. He returned home at the usual time, had dinner with Claire and the children, and pretended to go out to deal with work issues. He watched her as she tidied up the kitchen, keeping a calm expression, as if nothing was wrong. As he walked out the door, his heart raced. This time, he wouldn't be coming home the way she had hoped. She hid in her car, parked a few meters down the road, and waited. The night was dark, and the lights of the house cast a soft silhouette through the windows. After a while, he saw the hallway lights go out, indicating that Claire had gone up to her room. He stayed there, in the silence of the car, listening to the sound of his own breathing, mixed with the irregular rhythm of his heartbeat. Almost an hour later, a car pulled up smoothly in front of the house. Thomas watched carefully as the figure of a man got out of the vehicle and approached the entrance. The hall lights came on and he could see, through the window, Claire opening the door, smiling and welcoming the visitor with an intimacy that dispelled any doubts he might still have. Thomas felt a deep tightening in his chest, as if all the certainties he had about love, trust and the life they had built together were crumbling at once. The sight of Claire, laughing and talking to that man as if he were part of her world, left him paralyzed. He continued to watch, unable to move, as if the pain of the moment had rooted him there. Claire led the man inside, and the door closed softly, leaving only a vague light illuminating the entrance. Thomas, still outside, felt a mixture of humiliation and fury. How could she? How could she betray everything they had lived for, every moment, every promise? The night enveloped the house, and he, with his fists clenched, finally understood that the love he cherished so much had been tarnished, undone by something he had never expected from her. But at that moment, he decided that he would not be the victim. He stayed in the car for a few more minutes, waiting for the time to pass. When he thought he had waited long enough, he got out of the car and walked to the door. The lights were still on in the living room, but the house seemed plunged into a deep silence. He turned the key in the lock and entered the house with firm, silent steps. As he entered, he was greeted by the low sound of whispered voices coming from the bedroom. The scene before him was a portrait of betrayal, of an intimacy that should belong only to him. And there, on the threshold of the door, he felt confronted by the reality of a love that had gradually dissolved before his eyes. On noticing his presence, Claire stopped, surprised and embarrassed. Her lover, visibly disconcerted, tried to pull himself together, but Thomas's words cut through the silence before he could react. "You can leave now." His voice was cold, a tone of contempt that made Claire feel the weight of every lie he had told. Her lover stood up, clumsily, trying to escape the devastating situation. Claire remained silent, her expression perplexed, as if everything she could have said had been ripped from her mind the instant Thomas walked through the door. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the only sound was that of her lover rushing out, the door closing behind him. Thomas stood there, motionless, staring at Claire with an intensity that mixed hurt and disappointment. She tried to stammer out an explanation, a justification for something she knew could not be forgiven, but he interrupted her before the words came out. "There's nothing you can say that will change what you've done." She looked at him, her eyes watering, realizing that the choices she had made had led her down a path of no return. The silence between them was thick, as if every second revealed more about the chasm that had grown between them over time. The shock of the betrayal still pulsed through Thomas's mind, but he refused to let the pain take control. At that moment, his determination was stronger than any emotion. As he looked at Claire, he felt a conviction rise up inside him. Her betrayal would not be the end of his life, but the starting point for a decision that would change everything. Thomas spent the night sitting at the kitchen table, his mind swirling with thoughts about everything he had witnessed. The image of Claire next to another man, so at ease, felt like a punch every time it returned to his mind. He stared into the void, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the night outside, as if seeking answers to questions he didn't even want to have to ask. In the morning, the silence in the house was almost deafening. Claire came down the stairs with hesitant steps, her eyes swollen and red. She tried to speak to Thomas, but he ignored her and looked away coldly. She got a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, keeping her distance, her face marked by a pain and determination she had never seen before. She tried to break the silence, but every attempt at an excuse or explanation was interrupted by a hard, cutting stare. "There is no justification, Claire," he finally said, the words coming out with an overwhelming weight. She swallowed, fighting back the tears that threatened to burst out. "You've broken something you can never fix." He was quiet for a moment, staring out of the window, as if trying to absorb the reality around him. The house, which had once been a refuge, now seemed strange, cold, devoid of any warmth or security. He turned to Claire and announced, with a firmness that frightened her, "We're getting divorced." Claire shivered as she heard these words. She had never imagined that her betrayal would lead her to this point. She had always believed that, somehow, marriage would stand up to any mistake, that there would always be a chance of forgiveness. She tried to plead, but Thomas interrupted her again, now with something she never expected to hear. "I'm going to ask for full custody of the children." His voice didn't tremble, showed no signs of doubt, and the impact of those words hit Claire like a blow. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Thomas, please, you can't do this." She tried to hold his hand, but he pushed her away, as if her touch was poisonous. "I'm not doing this, Claire." "You did it." He sighed, as if searching for the right words, but instead let the silence speak for itself. "How do you expect to be a mother to them when you haven't even managed to be loyal to our marriage?" "Thomas, I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad mother. The children need me." Claire's voice was a mixture of despair and pleading, but Thomas wasn't moved. "Yes, they do. And that's exactly why I'm going to fight for them to stay with me. I don't want our children to grow up in an environment where they see betrayal and lying as acceptable behavior." He held her gaze, implacable. She cried, trying to find a way to make him understand, to convince him that this didn't mean she had lost her right to be a mother. But Thomas's gaze was unyielding, resolute, and she felt the weight of the choice she had made crumbling down on her. At that moment, their children, Liam and Sophie, came downstairs, awakened by their mother's altered voice. Seeing his father's gloomy look and his mother's broken face, Liam asked innocently, "Are you two fighting?" Thomas took a deep breath, controlling himself so as not to collapse in front of his children. He tried to smile, but it came out more bitter than he expected. "It's all right, son. We'll talk later." Claire watched the scene, desperate, knowing that she could be about to lose everything, including her connection with her children. It tormented her in a way she had never imagined she would feel. She had never foreseen the consequences of the betrayal, never foreseen the chasm that would open up between them. Later, Thomas left Claire alone and went off to find a lawyer specializing in divorce and custody. He was determined to see this through, to rebuild his life and protect his children from the pain and disillusionment he knew the future with Claire would bring. He went into the lawyer's office and explained the situation, relating everything he had discovered and detailing his intention to ask for custody of the children. The lawyer listened attentively, taking notes and nodding. "This is a difficult situation, Thomas," said the lawyer. But to get full custody, we'll need to show that there's more at stake here than just marital betrayal. Thomas then remembered every little detail, every suspicious behavior of Claire's in recent times, the times she left the house with lame excuses, leaving the children with babysitters or grandparents. Every absence of hers, every lie disguised as truth, everything seemed to fit together like pieces of a dark puzzle. He knew that Claire had put her desires and impulses above her family, and that, to him, was proof that she wasn't fit to prioritize her children. On returning home, Thomas found Claire in the living room, still shaken. She turned to him with a pleading look, but he simply looked away, unwilling to listen to any more excuses. The decision was made, and he wasn't going back. The next few days passed like a blur. Thomas was already preparing the documents for the lawsuit, and Claire was desperately trying to reverse the situation. She knew she would lose everything if Thomas took custody. But no matter how hard she tried, he seemed unshakable, as if every feeling for her had been ripped away, leaving only a cold, rational determination. That week, during a silent night, Thomas finally decided to confront her. After putting the children to bed, he called her into the living room for a chat. Claire watched him with an anxious expression, as if waiting for some kind of miracle. "I've tried to understand, Claire," he began, with a calmness that left her even more disconcerted. "But I can't. You've destroyed everything we've built, every promise, every moment I thought was real." He paused, as if searching for breath to continue. "And now you want me to believe that you still deserve to be a mother to our children?" She looked at him, tears silently streaming down her face. "Thomas, I never wanted it to come to this. I lost control. But that doesn't mean I don't love our children." He shook his head in disbelief. "Love isn't just words, Claire. It's action, it's commitment. You haven't done any of those things." He looked at her intensely, and she felt that his every word was a sentence. "The point is that, right now, I don't see in you the person I thought I loved, let alone someone who should be an example to our children." Claire tried to get closer to him, holding Thomas's face between her hands, as if that gesture might rekindle some feeling, some connection that might make him change his mind. "Please, Thomas. I know I made a mistake, but don't take this away from me. Don't take the children away from me. I'll do anything, anything to make it right." Thomas closed his eyes, breathing deeply as he tried to control the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume him. He disentangled himself from her, backing away slowly. "The problem, Claire," he said, almost in a whisper, "is that some things, once broken, can't be fixed." She sat down on the sofa, crumpled, feeling that everything was falling apart around her. As she looked at Thomas, she realized that he really had turned into someone distant, almost unrecognizable, a man who would not allow his trust to be betrayed again, nor his children to be exposed to an environment where loyalty and respect were treated as optional. That night, they both went to bed with the weight of the decision on them, but they knew that the truth, however painful, had already been revealed. The next morning, the weight of the words spoken and the decisions made hung over the house like a storm about to break. Claire passed the coffee mechanically, her gaze empty and fixed on the wall, still trying to process the whirlwind that her life had become in just a few days. Thomas silently put on his jacket, ignoring her gaze, immersed in thoughts that his fate, and the fate of his children, was already sealed. The connection between them had been irreversibly broken, and Claire realized that there was nothing she could say or do to regain the trust she had destroyed. Their children, Liam and Sophie, entered the kitchen with their school bags, carefree and oblivious to what was happening around them. Claire crouched down to fix Sophie's blouse, forcing a smile as she felt a lump in her throat, trying her best not to show her anguish. She knew that every gesture, every touch, could be coming to an end, that she could soon lose daily contact with her children. When Thomas took them to school, Claire stood in the doorway, watching them go. That image, of her children's backs disappearing with the man she had betrayed and who was now taking her away from her own family, was what made her feel the real extent of her loss. The life she had built, the home that had once been her refuge, everything was slipping out of her hands. In the weeks that followed, the divorce proceedings progressed rapidly. Thomas was determined to leave no room for reconciliation. He wanted distance from Claire and was determined to create a new home for his children, a place where they would be protected from the scars that betrayal had left on his heart. Thomas's lawyer was working intensely, making sure that every detail of the case was taken care of in order to secure custody of the children. Claire, on the other hand, was trying to stand on her own 2 feet as she faced the reality that she would lose daily contact with her children. Although she was devastated, something inside her knew that Thomas was adamant. He was firm in his decisions, and Claire had always known that. But now, what she had once admired in him frightened her, as she felt the weight of his choices on her skin. She tried, somehow, to get close to Thomas, but he kept her at a distance, his gaze conveying a coldness that made her shudder. When they spoke, it was only about practical matters, the sale of the house, the division of assets, questions about their children's future. Every word was cold and impersonal, as if he treated her like a stranger who, by chance, still occupied the same space. One afternoon, while they were meeting in the lawyer's office, Claire felt compelled to try one last approach. In the empty room, just the two of them waiting for the lawyer to return, she turned to him, her voice trembling. "Thomas, are you really not going to give me a chance? Our children deserve a complete family." Her voice was laden with desperation, an attempt to appeal to what remained of humanity between them. He took a deep breath, looking at her as if pondering those words. Finally, he answered, with a calm that disturbed her. "A complete family, Claire. I think that idea died the moment you made certain decisions." His gaze was distant, filled with a sadness that Claire couldn't decipher. "I've thought a lot about what our children deserve. And they deserve better than that." Claire felt the pain growing inside her, an emptiness that seemed to devour her. With each passing day, it became clearer that, for Thomas, she meant nothing more than a bitter memory, an open wound that he longed to heal. Even so, her silence only reinforced the certainty that there was no going back. Another morning, while Thomas was putting the final custody papers in order, he realized that something was bothering him deeply. He felt a heaviness in his chest, as if he was about to betray himself and his children by taking them away from their mother. Although he was sure that Claire didn't deserve his forgiveness, there was a complexity to the situation that he couldn't ignore. The image of Sophie, sitting in her room, talking about how much she missed her mother, or Liam's naive questions about why they were no longer together as a family, seemed to echo in his mind, feeding a guilt he didn't want to admit. It was a moral dilemma that Thomas never thought he would face. He wanted to protect them, to prevent them from seeing the disappointment and pain he carried. But at the same time, he began to wonder if separating them from their mother was really the answer. As much as he was hurting, he knew that, for his children, Claire was still an essential figure, someone who loved them, even if she had failed to be the partner he needed. While he pondered, Claire continued to fight, trying to show the court and Thomas himself that she was still a responsible mother. She attended every custody hearing with determination, trying to convey to the world, and to Thomas, that she had learned the hard lesson of her choices. The lawyers argued, presented evidence, while Thomas remained silent, impassive. But inside, every argument against Claire was like a blow that he could hardly bear. One evening, Thomas found himself alone in the kitchen, mentally reliving all the moments that had led up to that point. Sophie's confused look and Liam's sad smile were fixed in his mind, as if they were watching him from afar, waiting for a decision he didn't know if he could make. He was torn between two painful choices: to keep his children away from Claire, ensuring that they grew up in a safe environment, or to allow them to have the maternal companionship that, however imperfect, was still important to them. In the end, Thomas knew he couldn't act on his emotions alone. The wound in his chest hurt deeply, but he began to realize that it might be possible to create a solution that was less devastating for everyone. The next day, as he walked towards the court for one last hearing, he felt a strange sense of relief as he made his final decision. The hearing was brief, marked by a formality that contrasted with the intensity of what was at stake. Thomas stood up and, in front of the judge, asked to speak. With a firm voice but a hesitant heart, he made a proposal that took Claire and the lawyers by surprise. He agreed to share custody of the children, on the condition that she followed strict rules of cohabitation, ensuring that the children were protected emotionally. Claire took a deep breath, almost unable to believe what she was hearing. She felt a mixture of relief and gratitude, although she knew that Thomas's gesture was not a sign of reconciliation, but proof that he still prioritized his children's well-being above his own pain. Thomas turned to Claire at the end of the hearing, and their gazes met for a moment. He hadn't meant to imply that he had forgiven her, but his gaze conveyed something she hadn't expected, an acceptance of what couldn't be changed, but which, somehow, he was willing to endure for Sophie and Liam's sake. As she left the courtroom, Claire felt her heart pounding, an emotion she couldn't define. She knew that, from now on, she would have to build a new relationship with her children and somehow live with the memory that the man she had once loved deeply, and betrayed, had been capable of an act of compassion that she herself had not shown. The house, now divided by days and times, became a reflection of the complexity of their lives. With each exchange, with each smile from the children, Thomas and Claire dealt with the scars of their actions, aware that they had chosen a path that, although painful, was the best they could offer their children. Life took an unexpected course for Thomas and Claire after the divorce, with the weight of recent decisions silently reverberating in every aspect of their routines. The children began to alternate their weeks at home, living between two homes that, although comfortable and loving, carried the weight of family fragmentation. Thomas felt a strange calm mixed with a latent pain that arose whenever he left the children with Claire. He knew that his choice had been for their own good, but he couldn't help the emptiness that settled in his chest every time he returned to a silent, empty house. Despite everything, he refused to let that pain stop him from rebuilding his own life. He began to work even harder, trying to build a solid future for himself and his children, even though many nights were taken up by memories of what he had lost and the dreams that were now just shadows. One evening, Thomas was going through some old photos with Liam and Sophie when he noticed the nostalgia in his children's eyes. Sophie, in her sweet, hesitant voice, asked, "Daddy, you and Mommy were happy before, right?" That question, simple and full of innocence, hit him like an avalanche. Thomas looked her in the eye and, in a gesture of affection, pulled her into a tight hug. "Yes, we were very happy." And although that was the truth, he knew that the happiness that had once existed was now a memory, a painful lesson in how one's choices can change the fate of a family. Meanwhile, Claire was facing a silent challenge. Thomas's decision to share custody of the children had been a chance she couldn't pass up. However, the reality of only having the children half the time exposed her to crushing loneliness. Each week the children spent with Thomas was marked by an overwhelming emptiness, and she came to terms with a kind of pain she had never imagined feeling. The betrayal, which had once seemed just a mistake amidst the complexity of her life, now turned out to be an unbearable burden, a constant reminder that she had broken the trust of someone who had once loved her unconditionally. Trying to assuage her guilt and find a purpose, Claire decided to devote herself entirely to her career, using the time she spent without her children to immerse herself in art and teaching projects that she hoped would bring some meaning to her life. However, the satisfaction was fleeting, nothing filled the void that became more and more evident with each visit from her children. With each hug goodbye, she felt as if a piece of herself was being torn away, a pain she was beginning to understand as the true price of her choices. For the children, the impact was silent but profound. Liam and Sophie grew up alternating between two worlds, and although Thomas and Claire tried to offer stability and security, the smiles that were once innocent and full of joy now carried an early melancholy. They began to avoid questions about the past and, over time, learned to live with the new reality, adapting to the two homes they knew. One day, Sophie happened to find a letter from Claire addressed to Thomas, tucked away in her bedroom drawer. Curiosity made her read it quickly, but in just a few lines, she realized the weight of a deep regret that her mother was trying to express to her father. In simple, moving words, Claire was grateful for the chance to live with her children, even after everything she had done. She recognized that the consequences of her betrayal were insurmountable and that she lived each day as a penance, trying, in some way, to make up for the damage. Sophie kept this in her heart, feeling for the first time a compassion for her mother that, until then, she hadn't fully understood. That evening, when she returned to Claire's house, Sophie hugged her more tightly than usual, without saying a word about what she had discovered. For her, those words were enough to understand that, despite everything, her mother loved her deeply and was trying with all her might to make up for the mistakes of the past. Years later, Thomas met someone, a kind and loving woman who gave him the chance to start again. He fell in love slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid to open his heart again. But, little by little, he allowed himself to believe that love could be reborn, that, despite the pain he carried, there was still something good in store for him. Sophie and Liam, now teenagers, welcomed this new figure with caution, but also with genuine affection, recognizing that their father had finally found a piece of peace that he so deserved. Claire followed, from a distance, the happiness that Thomas had rediscovered. Although it brought her deep pain, it also brought her discreet relief. She knew that he had found a way to move on and, in a way, felt grateful that he had found someone capable of looking after him in the way that she herself had been unable to. One morning, Claire was sitting in the backyard of her house, looking at the flowers Sophie had planted. The garden was a living reminder of the little moments of joy she still shared with her children. Those moments, though brief, were enough for her to cling to the idea that there was still love in her life, that she could offer something valuable to them. Thomas and Claire never regained their former friendship or intimacy, but they began to treat each other with respect, something that came with time and acceptance of the choices they had made. They each went their separate ways, but the memory of what they had been and what they had lost became a lesson they would both carry with them forever. And so, between regret and resilience, between pain and reconstruction, their lives took new directions. The children grew up aware that love and trust are fragile, and that one person's choices can shape the future of an entire family. Over time, the two brothers came to understand better what had happened between their parents and to value the ability to start again, to find the strength to overcome even the deepest wounds. In the end, Thomas found peace and Claire, resignation. Their love, which had once been the foundation of everything, was now just a memory, a story marked by difficult decisions and inevitable consequences. But even in the ruins of the past, they both found a way to move on, learning to live with what was left, the strength of a father determined to protect his children and the persistence of a mother trying every day to regain their love. If you liked this story and want more impactful tales, comment below and share your opinion. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal, and the stories told here are meant to show how infidelity can destroy trust and love between people. Don't forget to subscribe for more exciting stories.